The phone rang once, twice. Then the operator's calm voice broke through. On the other end, Emily's breathing came in ragged gasps, her words tumbling out like shards of glass. He's trying to kill me, she cried, her voice cracking under the weight of terror. Ma'am, can you tell me your location? The operator asked, her tone measured but firm. Emily hesitated, as if struggling to focus. It's 246 Birchwood Lane, she managed, choking back a sob. Please hurry. He hit me. He threw me against the wall. Static crackled faintly on the line as the operator continued to guide her. Stay safe. Help is on the way. But Emily wasn't listening anymore. Her sobs grew louder, more desperate, until they dissolved into silence, a hollow void that left even the operator uneasy. Red and blue lights splashed across the pristine facade of 246 Birchwood Lane, casting an eerie glow over the manicured hedges and perfectly trimmed lawn. The house stood as a testament to suburban perfection, its white shutters gleaming under the moonlight. Neighbors peeked from behind their curtains, whispering to one another about the commotion in this neighborhood, where lawns were always green and secrets stayed buried deep. Something felt profoundly wrong. Two officers stepped out of their patrol car, boots crunching softly against the gravel driveway. Officer Ramirez scanned the quiet street before turning to his partner, Detective Harper. Place looks too nice for trouble, he muttered. Harper nodded grimly. That's usually when it finds you. They approached the front door, steeling themselves for whatever chaos awaited inside. When the door creaked open, Emily stumbled forward, clutching the frame for support. Her mascara-streaked face was a portrait of anguish, her lips trembling as she whispered hoarsely, "Thank God you're here." Her blouse hung loosely off one shoulder, torn at the seam, and a livid bruise bloomed along her jawline. A thin trickle of blood dried at the corner of her mouth, evidence of violence etched into every detail of her appearance. She reached out instinctively toward Harper, who steadied her with a gentle hand. "What happened?" Harper asked, his voice low but urgent. "It's Daniel," Emily choked out, tears streaming down her cheeks. He lost control. I don't know what set him off, but he started yelling, throwing things." She paused, swallowing hard. "I thought he was going to kill me." Ramirez exchanged a glance with Harper. This didn't feel like a false alarm, not with the bruises marring her skin or the raw fur in her eyes. Inside, the living room told its own story. A shattered vase lay scattered across the hardwood floor, glittering fragments catching the light. The coffee table had been overturned, magazines strewn haphazardly around the room. A framed photograph of Emily and Daniel lay face down near the fireplace. The glass cracked as though struck by something heavy. "This place looks like a war zone," Ramirez murmured, surveying the destruction. Emily clutched her arms tightly around herself, shivering despite the warmth of the house. "He just snapped," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the broken picture frame. "1 minute we were talking, and the next—" She trailed off, shaking her head. Harper knelt beside the debris, examining the scene carefully. It all seemed so real, the scattered remnants of a violent altercation, but something nagged at the edges of his mind, a faint unease he couldn't quite name. In the kitchen, Daniel sat slumped at the counter, his hands gripping the edge of the granite surface. His face was pale, his expression bewildered as Ramirez and Harper entered. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. "Why are the cops here?" "We received a call about domestic violence," Harper replied evenly, watching Daniel closely. Care to explain? Daniel blinked, incredulous. Domestic violence? Are you kidding me? I didn't touch her. His protests fell flat as Emily appeared in the doorway, her tear-streaked face a stark contrast to his confusion. Don't lie to them, Daniel, she said softly, her voice laced with pain. You know what you did? Ramirez moved quickly, pulling Daniel to his feet and snapping handcuffs around his wrists. You have the right to remain silent. As Daniel was led away, his protests growing louder, Emily collapsed against the doorframe, burying her face in her hands. Her body shook with sobs, each one more wrenching than the last. Once the officers were gone, Emily straightened slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. For a moment, she simply stood there, staring at the empty doorway where Daniel had disappeared. Then, almost imperceptibly, her lips curved upward in a satisfied smile. She walked to the mirror in the hallway, studying her reflection. With deliberate care, she adjusted her hair, smoothing it into place. The bruise on her cheek looked convincing enough, but she dabbed at it lightly with a tissue, ensuring it remained visible. You played your part well, she murmured to herself, her voice cold and detached. Behind her, the sound of footsteps echoed faintly from upstairs. Startled, she turned, but no one was there. Shaking off the momentary unease, she returned to the living room, tidying up the mess with practiced efficiency. Hours earlier, Emily had stood in front of the same mirror, holding a tube of concealer in one hand and a compact in the other. Her movements were precise, methodical, as she applied makeup to create the illusion of injury. She pressed her fingers against her cheek, leaving faint red marks that would later darken into convincing bruises. Her reflection stared back at her, devoid of emotion. She practiced her expressions, wide-eyed terror, heartbroken despair, until they felt natural. When she finally smiled, it was chilling. A predator baring its teeth. Back in the present, Emily watched from the window as the police car pulled away, Daniel's silhouette visible in the back seat. The corners of her mouth twitched upward again, a fleeting flicker of triumph. But then, her smile faltered. Behind her, the sound of footsteps grew louder this time, real, unmistakable. Slowly she turned, her heart pounding. Standing in the doorway was someone unexpected, someone who knew the truth. And suddenly, Emily realized her perfect plan might not be so foolproof after all. Emily Harper was the kind of woman people noticed. Her tailored blazers, perfectly coiffed hair, and razor-sharp wit made her a standout in any room. At 32, she had climbed the ranks of her marketing firm with relentless determination, earning admiration from colleagues who whispered about her killer instincts behind closed doors. But beneath the polished veneer lay cracks, deep fissures that no amount of success could mend. Her childhood had been a battlefield. Parents screaming late into the night, accusations flying like shrapnel until their marriage imploded when she was 10. What followed was a carousel of failed relationships, each one ending in bitter disappointment. Men came and went, leaving Emily convinced she wasn't enough. Not smart enough, not beautiful enough, not worthy enough. These insecurities simmered just below the surface, invisible to most but gnawing at her constantly. Daniel Monroe, on the other hand, seemed immune to life's chaos. A talented architect with a penchant for sketching dream homes during idle moments. He exuded calmness, like it was second nature. Raised in a close-knit family where love flowed freely, Daniel approached life with an optimism that bordered on infuriating. He adored Emily, lavishing her with affection and small gestures. A handwritten note tucked into her purse, a surprise dinner reservation after a tough day at work. To outsiders, they were opposites who balanced each other perfectly. To Emily, however, Daniel's stability felt suffocating. His ability to glide through life unscathed only highlighted her own struggles. She envied his ease, his lack of scars, and yet she clung to him desperately, terrified of losing the one person who still saw her as whole. At parties, Emily and Daniel were magnetic. They laughed easily, finishing each other's sentences and stealing lingering glances that left guests sighing wistfully. Friends often remarked how lucky they were to find someone so perfect for them. Social media painted an even rosier picture. Sun-drenched photos of beach vacations, cozy snapshots by the fireplace, captions dripping with saccharine sweetness. But behind closed doors, the illusion crumbled. Emily spent hours scrutinizing herself in the mirror, comparing her reflection to the effortless grace she imagined Daniel possessed. Why couldn't she be more like him? More composed, more content. The disparity between her inner turmoil and his outward serenity bred resentment, though she buried it beneath layers of forced smiles and polite conversation. It started innocently enough. A text notification lighting up Daniel's phone while they sat together on the couch. Emily glanced over, catching sight of a name she didn't recognize. Claire. Just a co-worker, Daniel assured her, brushing off her concern with a laugh, but Emily couldn't let it go. Over time, these minor incidents multiplied. Late nights at the office became frequent excuses. Casual mentions of Claire turned into something darker in Emily's mind. She replayed conversations, dissecting every word for hidden meaning. By the time she found herself scrolling through Daniel's call log under the guise of charging his phone, she knew she was spiraling. But stopping felt impossible. "Why are you doing this?" she muttered to her reflection one night, gripping the edge of the bathroom sink. "He loves you." Yet doubt clawed at her chest, feeding on her deepest fears. Abandonment, betrayal, worthlessness. Desperate for reassurance, Emily confided in Lila, her best friend since college. Over coffee at their favorite cafe, she hesitated before broaching the subject. "I think Daniel might be seeing someone else," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Leela raised an eyebrow, stirring sugar into her latte. "You're being ridiculous, Em. He worships the ground you walk on." "But what if I'm not imagining things?" Emily pressed, her hands trembling around her mug. "What if there really is someone?" Leela sighed, setting down her spoon. "Look, I get it. You're stressed about the wedding, and all this planning has your head spinning. But accusing Daniel of cheating? That's crazy talk. Trust him, okay?" Emily nodded, forcing a smile, but Lila's words stung. Instead of comfort, she felt dismissed, invalidated, alone again. As weeks passed, Emily withdrew further into herself. Invitations went unanswered. Calls from friends went ignored. Nights stretched endlessly as she lay awake, staring at the ceiling or scrolling obsessively through Daniel's social media profiles. Every photo, every comment thread became fuel for her paranoia. She began Googling phrases like signs of infidelity and how to know if your partner is lying. Articles promised answers, but none provided relief. Instead, they deepened her conviction that Daniel was hiding something. The loneliness consumed her, wrapping its tendrils around her heart until breathing felt like a chore. One evening, Daniel tried to bridge the growing distance between them. "Hey," he said softly, sitting beside her on the couch. "Is everything okay?" You've seemed distant lately. Emily forced another brittle smile. I'm fine, just tired. But inside, she recoiled. How dare he act concerned now? Didn't he realize he was the source of her pain? Late one night, long after Daniel had fallen asleep, Emily sat hunched over her laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated her face, casting eerie shadows across her features. She clicked through article after article. How false accusations can ruin lives. Staging evidence in domestic violence cases. Legal loopholes exploited by victims. Each headline sent a thrill coursing through her veins. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of control. If Daniel wouldn't give her the validation she craved, perhaps she could take it. Perhaps she could make him see how much he needed her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she bookmarked page after page. Somewhere in the recesses of her mind, a voice screamed that this was wrong, that she was crossing a line she couldn't uncross. But the voice was faint, drowned out by the intoxicating promise of power. When Daniel stirred in bed, mumbling incoherently, Emily quickly shut the laptop. She slipped beneath the covers beside him, her heart racing. As she stared at the ceiling, a plan began to form, one that would change both their lives forever. The bathroom light flickered softly as Emily stood in front of the mirror, her reflection pale and drawn. In one hand, she held a stiff makeup brush, its bristles sharp against her skin. She hesitated for a moment, then pressed it firmly into the soft flesh of her upper arm. A sharp sting shot through her, followed by a dull ache. She winced but didn't stop, until a faint red mark began to bloom. Perfect, she whispered, tilting her head to examine the bruise. It wasn't too severe, just enough to look believable. When Daniel walked into the kitchen later that evening, Emily was waiting. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her expression brittle. "Do you even remember last night?" she asked, her voice trembling with manufactured hurt. Daniel frowned, setting down his coffee mug. "Last night? What are you talking about?" "This." Emily pulled back the sleeve of her sweater, revealing the bruise. "You grabbed me during our fight." His face paled. "I never touched you, Em. You know that." But Emily's gaze hardened, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "That's what they all say." Over the next few days, Daniel noticed subtle changes in Emily's behavior. She snapped at him over trivial things, a misplaced key, a forgotten grocery item, and retreated to bed early most nights. He chalked it up to wedding stress. After all, planning a marriage wasn't easy. Still, something about her demeanor unsettled him. One evening, he tried to pull her close on the couch, his voice gentle. "Hey, I know this is a lot, but we'll get through it together, okay?" Emily stiffened in his arms, pulling away slightly. "Together? You don't even notice how hard this is for me." "I'm trying," he said, frustration creeping into his tone. "But you're shutting me out." She didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the wall ahead. For the first time, Daniel wondered if there was more to her withdrawal than just nerves. A week later, Daniel returned home from work to find shards of glass scattered across the living room floor. The remnants of the favorite vase lay in jagged pieces near the fireplace. His stomach sank as Emily emerged from the hallway, her face streaked with tears. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice low. "You did," she spat, her voice shaking. "You threw it when I told you I needed help cleaning up. Don't you remember?" Daniel stared at her, incredulous. "Em, I wasn't even here. How could I have done this?" But Emily only shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. Maybe you don't remember because you were so angry. Just clean it up, please. He knelt to pick up the fragments, guilt gnawing at him, despite knowing he was innocent. If apologizing would keep the peace, he'd do it. But every apology felt like another brick in a wall he couldn't climb. Late one night, Emily sat alone in bed, clutching a burner phone. Her fingers hovered over the keypad before typing, "You're worthless. No one will ever love you." She sent the message to her own number, then quickly deleted it from the burner device. The next morning, she showed the texts to her therapist, Dr. Monroe. "It started a few weeks ago," she explained, her voice cracking. "At first, it was just mean comments. Now I'm scared." Dr. Monroe nodded sympathetically, jotting notes onto her legal pad. "Have you considered reporting these messages to the police?" Emily shook her head. "I don't want to make things worse, but it's getting harder to ignore." As she left the session, Emily allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Each fabricated text brought her closer to her goal. Emily's campaign of isolation began subtly. At dinner with Daniel's family, she mentioned offhandedly, "He's been under so much pressure lately. Sometimes I worry about his temper." His mother raised an eyebrow. "Temper? That doesn't sound like Daniel." "It's not always obvious," Emily replied, feigning concern. "But I think the stress is getting to him." Soon, whispers spread among their circle of friends. When Daniel's brother, Ethan, invited him to a weekend getaway, Emily intervened. "I really need you here this weekend," she pleaded, her eyes wide. "Please, just stay." Reluctantly, Daniel cancelled his plans. As the invitations dwindled and the distance grew, Emily felt a twisted sense of triumph. Daniel's patience wore thin. Every attempt to reason with Emily ended in arguments or icy silence. One afternoon, exasperated, he confided in Sarah, a co-worker who had become a trusted friend. "She's accusing me of things I didn't do," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to do anymore." Sarah tilted her head thoughtfully. "Have you thought about couples therapy? Maybe a neutral third party can help." Daniel sighed. "I've suggested it, but she refuses, says it's unnecessary." Sarah frowned. "That doesn't sound healthy, Dan. Be careful." Her words lingered in his mind long after the conversation ended. Careful of what, though? Himself or Emily? One evening, Emily scrolled through Daniel's phone while he showered. A single text caught her eye. "Hey, just checking in on the deadline. Let me know if you need anything." Sent by Sarah. Emily's pulse quickened. Perfect. When Daniel emerged from the bathroom, towel slung low around his hips, Emily confronted him. "Who's Sarah?" she demanded, holding up the phone. He blinked, confused. "What are you doing with my phone? And Sarah's just a co-worker." "A co-worker who checks in on deadlines?" Emily's voice rose laced with venom. "Don't lie to me, Daniel." "There's nothing to lie about," he shot back, anger flaring. "Why are you twisting everything?" For a moment, they stared at each other, the air thick with tension. Then Daniel turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Unbeknownst to Daniel, Emily had activated a recording app on her phone moments before the argument began. The microphone captured every word, the sharpness of his tone, the desperation in hers. When he left, she replayed the audio, listening intently. His raised voice sounded harsh, almost menacing. Her sobs echoed plaintively, painting a vivid picture of victimhood. Satisfied? She saved the file, tucking it away for future use. As the echo of Daniel's footsteps faded down the hallway, Emily's trembling ceased. Slowly, deliberately, she wiped away her tears, her lips curving into a chilling smile. She opened the recording again, leaning back against the couch cushions. With each playback, her satisfaction deepened. This was it, the final piece of evidence she needed to dismantle his life. Outside, rain began to patter against the windows, masking the coolness in her gaze. Emily knew exactly what came next, and she was ready. The air crackled with tension as Emily stood in the middle of the living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Daniel entered, still damp from his shower, and immediately sensed the storm brewing. "Why are you always so distant?" Emily demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory. "You barely even look at me anymore." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his wet hair. I've been working late, you know that." "Working late or texting Sarah?" She shot back, her tone laced with venom. His jaw tightened. "This again?" "I told you, there's nothing going on between us." But Emily pressed forward, her words slicing like knives. "Then why do you ignore me when I need you? Why don't you care about us?" Her deliberate provocation worked. Frustration bubbled to the surface, and Daniel's voice rose. "Because every time I try to fix things, you twist my words. How am I supposed to win here?" Unseen by him, Emily's phone rested on the counter, recording every syllable. She let the argument escalate, feeding off his anger until it reached a fever pitch. When he finally stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him, she allowed herself a brief, triumphant smirk. Once alone, Emily moved swiftly. From the kitchen drawer, she retrieved a heavy rolling pin, its wooden handle cool against her palm. With a deep breath, she braced herself and struck her own arm, not hard enough to cause lasting damage, but sufficient to leave an ugly bruise. The pain made her wince, but she didn't stop there. Using the edge of the rolling pin, she pressed it into her thigh, creating another mark. Next came the cuts. A shard of broken glass from earlier experiments lay hidden under the sink. She dragged it lightly across her forearm, drawing thin lines of blood that welled up instantly. It stung, but she bit down on her lip, refusing to cry out. Satisfied with her work, Emily turned her attention to the room itself. She overturned chairs, smashed picture frames, and scattered shards of glass across the floor. Every detail was calculated. The chaos had to appear authentic. By the time she finished, the space looked like the aftermath of a violent altercation. Her hands trembled as she dialed 911, clutching the phone like a lifeline. When the operator answered, Emily's voice quivered with manufactured terror. "Please help me," she whispered, gasping for breath. "My fiancé. He attacked me." "What's your address?" the operator asked calmly, though urgency tinged her tone. 246 Birchwood Lane, Emily replied, her sobs growing louder. "Hurry, he might come back." She hung up moments later, collapsing onto the couch as if drained. Her performance was flawless, each sob, each ragged inhale designed to convince anyone listening that she was a victim, fighting for survival. Within minutes, red and blue lights bathed the house in an eerie glow. 2 officers stepped inside, their expressions grim as they took in the destruction. Furniture lay askew, glass glittered ominously on the floor, and Emily sat hunched on the couch, visibly shaken. "He did this," she said hoarsely, pointing toward Daniel, who stood frozen near the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I didn't touch her," Daniel protested, his voice cracking. "This is insane. I walked out before anything happened." But Emily's injuries spoke volumes. The fresh bruises on her arms, the cuts marring her skin. To the officers, the evidence seemed damning. They exchanged skeptical glances before moving to restrain him. As handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Daniel's protests grew desperate. "You have to believe me. I wouldn't hurt her. I love her." Emily watched silently, her gaze steady despite the turmoil swirling within her. As the officers led Daniel away, she called out weakly, "I'm sorry it came to this." Her voice broke, adding one final layer of authenticity to her act. Through the window, she watched the police car pull away, its taillights disappearing into the night. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of peace, a fleeting sense of control restored. With Daniel gone, Emily set about cleaning up the remnants of her staged drama. Each shattered piece of glass, each splintered fragment of furniture served as a reminder of her victory. She hummed softly to herself, a haunting melody that echoed through the empty house. For once, her mind wasn't clouded by doubt or fear. Everything had gone according to plan. No one would question her story. Not the police, not Daniel's family, not even Lila. She was safe, or so she thought. Midway through tidying the living room, a sudden realization struck Emily like a punch to the gut. Weeks ago, paranoid about Daniel's alleged infidelity, she'd installed a hidden camera in the corner of the ceiling. At the time, it had seemed like a clever precaution, but now it posed a catastrophic risk. Her heart raced as she scrambled to retrieve the device. What if it had recorded her self-inflicted injuries? What if someone else accessed the footage? Panic clawed at her throat as she plugged the camera into her laptop. The screen flickered to life, displaying hours of mundane activity. And then, horrifyingly, the moment she'd struck herself with the rolling pin, her stomach churned as she frantically deleted the file, praying no one else had seen it. But the seed of doubt had already taken root. Had she been too careless? Too confident? Unbeknownst to Emily, Daniel's younger brother, Ethan, a tech-savvy engineer, had been monitoring the camera remotely. Suspicious of Emily's accusations, he'd decided to review the footage himself. As the video played, Ethan's initial curiosity morphed into shock. There she was, deliberately harming herself, staging the scene with chilling precision. His hands clenched into fists as the truth sank in. Emily had orchestrated everything. For a moment, he sat motionless, staring at the screen. Then determination hardened his features. He couldn't let her get away with this, not without exposing the truth. Reaching for his phone, Ethan dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Detective Harper," he said quietly, his voice steady, despite the rage simmering beneath the surface. "We need to talk." The heavy steel door clanged shut behind Daniel as he stepped out into the cold, grey morning. The bail had been secured after weeks of legal wrangling, but freedom felt hollow. His name was splashed across headlines: architect accused of domestic violence, and strangers whispered his story in grocery store aisles. Friends who once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact. When he returned to the house, it was eerily silent. The air smelled stale, untouched since the night of the arrest. Broken furniture still lay scattered where Emily had staged her charade. Each shattered piece seemed to mock him, a jagged reminder of the life he'd lost. He sank onto the couch, staring at the empty space where the wedding photo used to hang. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to cry, not out of anger or frustration, but sheer exhaustion. Ethan sat in Detective Harper's office, his hands trembling slightly as he handed over a USB drive containing the damning footage. "This proves she lied," he said firmly, his voice laced with both resolve and sorrow. She hurt herself. She set all of this up. Harper watched the video in stunned silence, his expression darkening with each passing second. When it ended, he exhaled sharply. This changes everything. Within hours, the footage made its way to the press. Social media erupted with outrage as screenshots of Emily's calculated self-harm spread like wildfire. Comment sections filled with vitriol. How could she do this? Poor Daniel. He didn't deserve this. Public opinion shifted overnight. What had once been sympathy for Emily dissolved into disgust. Reporters camped outside her apartment, shouting questions about her motives. Her polished facade crumbled under the weight of scrutiny, leaving only a desperate woman clinging to lies that no longer held water. Detective Harper entered the interrogation room, setting the file folder down with deliberate care. Across the table, Emily sat hunched forward, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Gone was the poised executive. In her place was a fragile shadow of a woman, her makeup smeared and her eyes bloodshot. "We know what you did," Harper began, sliding the transcript of Ethan's findings toward her. "We have the footage. There's no point denying it anymore." Emily stared at the papers, her breath hitching. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she finally broke. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "I just wanted him to see how much I needed him." Her confession poured out in fragments, disjointed and raw. She admitted to staging the injuries, fabricating the threats, manipulating everyone around her. Each word seemed to strip away another layer of her humanity until there was nothing left but guilt and shame. "I thought if I made him feel guilty, he'd love me again," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But now I've ruined everything." Hours later, officers arrived at Emily's door. She opened it without resistance, her face pale and drawn. As they cuffed her, she glanced back at the apartment one last time, her eyes lingering on the mirror, where she'd practiced her distraught expressions. The walk to the patrol car felt endless. Cameras flashed as reporters shouted questions, but Emily kept her gaze fixed on the ground. Once inside the vehicle, she slumped against the seat, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The confident woman who had orchestrated such an intricate web of deceit was gone, replaced by someone broken and unrecognizable. At the station, she was booked quietly, her mugshot capturing the emptiness in her eyes. For the first time, she faced the full weight of her actions and the realization that redemption might be impossible. Weeks passed, but Daniel found little solace in the truth coming to light. The scars ran deeper than any physical wound. Trust, once so easily given, now felt like a distant memory. He cancelled plans with friends, unable to stomach their pitying glances or awkward attempts at comfort. Even Lila's calls went unanswered. One afternoon, he sat in a therapist's office, fidgeting with the hem of his sweater. "I keep replaying it in my head," he admitted, his voice strained. "Every argument, every accusation, it all makes sense now. But I can't stop wondering. Why me? Why would she do this?" The therapist nodded gently. Betrayal often leaves us questioning not just the other person, but ourselves. It's okay to feel angry, hurt, even betrayed. Healing takes time. Daniel swallowed hard, nodding slowly. He knew rebuilding wouldn't be easy. The trust he'd placed in Emily had been shattered, and while forgiveness might come eventually, forgetting wasn't an option. Still, as he left the session, He allowed himself a small measure of hope. Maybe, someday, he could find peace again. The dim light from a single lamp cast long shadows across Daniel's apartment, the silence broken only by the faint ticking of a clock. He sat slumped on the edge of his couch, a glass of whiskey dangling loosely in one hand. His gaze was fixed on the empty space where their wedding photo used to hang, but it wasn't the absence of the frame that weighed on him. It was the memories it represented. "I gave her everything," he murmured, his voice low and raw. "My trust, my love. I thought she felt the same." He took a shaky sip of the amber liquid, wincing as it burned its way down his throat. His mind replayed every moment, the arguments, the accusations, the lies, and each recollection carved another fissure into his already fractured heart. "How could I have been so blind?" he asked no one in particular, his tone heavy with self-reproach. "Was I too eager to believe in us? Too desperate to make it work?" He set the glass down with a thud, burying his face in his hands. The weight of betrayal pressed down on him like an invisible force, suffocating and relentless. Would he ever trust again? Could he risk opening himself up to someone new, knowing how easily love could turn into ruin? For now, the answer eluded him. All he knew was the bitter taste of regret and the haunting realization that sometimes even the purest intentions can lead to the darkest outcomes. In the sterile confines of her jail cell, Emily sat hunched on the edge of a metal cot, her fingers twisting nervously around the hem of her orange jumpsuit. A reporter sat across from her, notebook in hand, but Emily barely noticed. Her eyes were distant, haunted by the ghosts of choices she couldn't undo. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she began, her voice trembling. I wanted him to see me, to need me the way I needed him." She paused, swallowing hard as tears welled in her eyes. "But instead, I lost him completely." Her words came haltingly, each syllable laden with guilt. It wasn't about hate or anger. It was fear. Fear that he'd leave me, that I wasn't enough. And when those feelings took over, she trailed off, shaking her head. "I became someone I don't recognize anymore." Her voice cracked as she continued. "He loved me, truly loved me, and I threw it all away because I was too afraid to let myself be vulnerable." She buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs. For the first time, she understood the magnitude of what she had done and the irreversible damage it had caused. As Emily's confession echoed through the cold walls of the prison, the narrative shifted outward, exploring the broader implications of her actions. Insecurity, left unchecked, had transformed into manipulation, a toxic cycle fueled by fear and desperation. Emily's story was not unique. Countless others had walked similar paths, driven by the need for control or validation at any cost. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. Relationships thrive on mutual respect and honesty, yet they are fragile constructs, easily shattered by deception. The emotional toll of betrayal extends beyond the individuals involved, rippling outward to affect families, friends, and communities. Emily's descent served as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how insecurity and manipulation can erode even the strongest bonds. Love alone isn't enough to sustain a relationship. Without communication and vulnerability, it becomes a house built on sand, destined to collapse under pressure. The camera lingered on Emily as she sat alone in her cell, clutching a crumpled wedding photo between trembling fingers. The image captured a happier time. Daniel smiling brightly beside her, both radiant with hope and promise. Now, Those smiles felt like relics from another life, a life she had destroyed with her own hands. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks, leaving glistening trails against her pale skin. She traced the outline of Daniel's face with her thumb, longing for a connection that could never be restored. The silence of the cell enveloped her, amplifying the emptiness within. As the screen faded to black, the sound of her muffled sobs lingered, haunting and unresolved. The audience was left with a lingering sense of loss, not just for the lives shattered by Emily's actions, but for the fragility of human connection itself. Love, trust, and redemption are delicate threads, easily severed by the sharp edges of fear and deceit.